Many stories in Dungeons & Dragons involve adventurers delving deep into forgotten ruins in search of incredible treasures. But all stories in Dungeons & Dragons come from people. The more people involved, the bigger the story. Add enough people and all of a sudden, the stories aren't just about adventure and treasure, they're about ideas and philosophies. They're about taking sides in a conflict. We're talking about order versus chaos, or good versus evil, about law and lawlessness, or vice and virtue, and all of those stories that are about something bigger than your individual characters alone. In this episode of A Whole New World, we're talking about factions. A faction is a group of people that represents one side of an argument. It could be an argument that has many different sides, or it could be an argument that has just two, but that's the important part. No faction exists alone. Play between factions is what gives your setting movement. The imbalance between factions works like a dynamo. Whether it's underdogs versus a tyrannical ruler or a secret cult working to undermine the order of a city, factions provide a frame, a context, or a weight for the larger stories in your setting. But how do you come up with factions to populate your setting? What makes a good faction tick? And how do you, as a dungeon master, use factions in your game? To come up with a faction for your world, you have to think in two different directions: the macro and the micro, or rather, the big picture and the inner workings. What makes your faction tick, as well as where your faction sits in relation to the wider world. There are several different lenses to look at factions through, from the biggest level to the smallest level, and though there are ones that I think are more important than the others, none of them should necessarily take precedence. If you find inspiration at any level, start there and work your way in any different direction. To start talking about factions in this case, we're going to start big and work small, from macro to micro. So, without further ado, do any of you remember The Mighty Ducks? It was a hockey movie in 1992 starring Emilio Estevez and Foggy Nelson. I bring it up because, weirdly enough, The Mighty Ducks is an excellent movie to look at if you want to learn how to build a faction. There are two main teams in this movie. The bad guys, who are rich with black and silver uniforms, who are win at all costs type of people who value nothing so much as victory. And then there is the good team, who, though they happen to be poor, are full of personal integrity and honor, who value teamwork and virtue above winning the game. Their uniforms are colorful, and they feature a diverse cast of many different types of people, all working together for the same goal. Quack. Quack. I'm starting here at The Mighty Ducks because this happens to be an excellent movie to introduce our first and biggest concept: ideals. Ideals are the concepts that your faction represents. It's sort of a wibbly idea, but you're more familiar with it than you think you are. If they're the good guys, what makes them good? If they're the bad guys, why do we think they're bad? Or if it's a moral judgment-free set of factions, does one maybe favor intellectualism while the other favors raw strength? The ideals of your faction are the central motivating concept that this faction represents. Some central concept or motivation that all of the members agree on some level or another. An idea that serves as the guiding principle for the faction's existence. When choosing the ideal for your faction, you have a huge variety of things to choose from. Anything from principles to philosophies to rallying behind a particular person or idea, to something maybe as simple as a loose affiliation of people who all have the same career, like a guild or a union. No matter what you settle on, this is the gooey caramel center of your faction, the rules by which this faction operates. This is important in your game world, but it's also important in the real world as well. This is what we, as an audience and as people who don't live in your game world, can understand about your game world. What we can agree with or disagree with. To establish the ideals of a faction, I have a couple of different ways you can go about it. First, if you're feeling confident enough in what you want this faction to represent, I would say you should ask yourself, What do they value? Come up with a list of 1 to 3 core convictions that this faction holds. Is it maybe honor, or skill, or martial prowess? Do each of the members know a secret that they've sworn to protect? The other way to get at this concept is to think of 2 or 3 questions that your setting will ask of this faction, and then decide how this faction will answer them. Pose questions to a random member of this faction like, is it okay to steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving family? Do you accept the Red Dragon's dubious offer of protection? What happens if some rando attacks a member of the faction? I have an extreme version of this as well. What, if threatened, would be more valuable than an individual member of this faction's life? Or rather, X will happen if you don't die right now. Are you cool with that? This village will be enslaved right now if you don't lay down your life. Are you okay with that? Chances are you already have an idea in the back of your mind about what the ideals of this faction are. The important thing right now is just to get a rough sketch of it out on paper. And the reason I start with this is that factions can manifest in any number of different ways. You could even have, like, baristas who believe in a code of individual ethics versus baristas who are interested in nothing but crass self-interest. The thing about this that makes it interesting is the clash of ideals. Who will win? I don't know, but the important thing about this isn't the fact that they're baristas. This is, however, an introduction to the second step in our examination of factions, the facts of a faction. If the last question was, who is this faction? This is, what is the faction? You can start here, and in fact, a lot of times it might be easier to start at this point and then work backwards towards ideals, but the reason I say this is second is it's more contingent upon the context of your world, and might be easier to work as coming from ideals rather than leading to them. The facts of your faction are much more dependent on the context of your world. The facts rely on the information that your setting provides. I have one really good central question about how to decide the facts of your faction, and it's this. Where is the argument taking place and what language is it in? And this is a metaphor, of course. But for example, say you have a setting where a bunch of countries are fighting over the same territory. That's the argument. Now, the language that it takes place in is maybe martial prowess. Who has the better industry to provide weapons of war? Who has a better spy network to influence the outcome of a battle? Who has the better skill at arms in order to fight the battle more adeptly? These are the languages in which the argument is taking place. And you can transpose this in any number of different ways, like, for example, merchant princes in a city. They're all trying to fight over the same thing, which is, money, but they're all using different types of language to address it. Like maybe one faction in this battle uses a monopoly on a certain trade good, or the other uses harsh negotiating skills. Maybe another has a secret society that they rely on for influence. All of these different languages are being used to address the same argument, but they all provide a very distinct approach for creating a faction. If I'm going to use my example that I have written down here, there is a faction that is a sect of elite spies who sell their skills to the highest bidder. They use ciphers and codes and disguises and all that, and they typically try to avoid violence. In the same world, there might be an elite bodyguard whose sole purpose is protecting a prince. They value loyalty over everything else, and they are totally okay with using violence. Both of these factions operate in response to the same argument, but both use a different approach to address the situation at hand. So how do you come up with these factions? How do you come up with their techniques and methodologies? What are their mechanics, in other words, and how do you come up with them? I would say start with just a basic idea of what they are. So, a guild of honorable thieves, or the warlord's inner circle. Take a look at your setting and figure out where the arguments are. Then come up with different techniques and tactics that people have come up with to address the argument and influence its outcome. Like I said, sometimes it's easier to come up with this first and then go back to the ideals later, once you have an idea of what this faction is in the world. Next, we come to my favorite part, the flavor of the faction. The flavor of your faction is the actual physical expression of this faction in the world. It's a manifestation of their ideals as much as it is what they look like walking down the street. Hold on, hold that thought. My cat's meowing. This is my producer. What do you think? Get me the heck out of here, I hate this. Alright, where were we? Oftentimes, the flavor comes from the ideals and the facts of your faction. It includes everything from their uniforms to the iconography, what they put on their flag, as well as what type of weaponry they use, or what their armor looks like. A great example of this is the Harpers from the Greyhawk setting by Ed Greenwood. They're a sect of do-good bards and magic users who take the harp behind, I think, a crescent moon, or in front of crescent moon, on their flag. Everyone in that setting knows that the harp and the crescent moon mean that the person flying them is probably a good guy. To get at the flavor of your faction, what you want to do is start thinking about things associated with their ideals and their facts. For example, a guild of bakers might have on their flag some wheat. Good bakers might have a loaf of bread. Evil bakers might have a knife or an oven. Their uniforms could be like goldenrod and cream or pumpernickel brown, that sort of thing. A warlike faction could have a hawk as an emblem. A faction that values teamwork and cooperation could have a duck. A mighty, mighty duck. And this extends to the materials that they use as well. For example, a martial-based evil faction might have jagged, soot-stained armor that has a lot of fearsome shapes and sharp edges, whereas a faction of proud knights that defend honor and innocence might have shining, polished armor. And you can play around with this too, like the shining polished armor might be a sign of their ostentatiousness or the fact that they think they're better than you. Or, say they don't wear armor at all. Maybe it's a group of spies and they have a secret handshake or some sort of symbol that they have tattooed on their body. I recently read in a textbook on video game design a chapter on theme, and this is sort of the theme of your faction. Everything that your faction does or has, uses to represent themselves can be an expression of their facts and their ideals. Every manifestation that they have in the world of your game or your setting can be some expression of the things that we've talked about previously. For an excellent example of this, take a look at Game of Thrones. Each house in Game of Thrones has distinct iconography that expresses the values that house represents. So the Starks are wolves. They're very loyal, but perhaps a little bit harsh. Much of their armor is just basic and functional with padded leather and iron. The Lannisters, on the other hand, are lions. They're proud and powerful, but perhaps a little bit vain, and maybe a little too used to being in control. Greyjoys are krakens, and they're basically just really good at killing things on the ocean. Boltons are that. Everyone in Game of Thrones tells you who they are by the flags that they fly, or the colors that they wear. So how do you come to this expression of your faction's ideals or truths? One technique that I use to build my faction's flavor or their theme is to just start with a few key details and then start writing down on a scratch sheet of paper, brainstorm ideas for things that are associated with these key details. So like, for example, I have written here, Loyal Guards of the True King, or Secret Evil Order of Mages. Then start to think of things that could be associated with those. So, for example, on my list here, for the evil mages, we have the color purple, a key, an eye, books, a secret religious book, and so on. The Loyal Guards could be a dog, the color white, shining armor, a crown, or maybe a specific type of weapon. Use this as sort of a mood board or a set of themes that you can iterate on to come up with their armor or their weapons or what colors they wear when they walk down the street. Out of all of this, you might want to choose one or two objects that they put on their flag as their emblem. Sort of a shorthand to indicate this faction. Their version of the Harper's harp. So, okay, we have a pretty good faction right now. We've got their ideals, whether they're a good guy or a bad guy or, what they stand for in your world. We have their facts, which is how those ideals manifest and how they implement their various and sundry schemes and machinations. And we also have their flavor and theme, which is kind of a manifestation of those other things that we were talking about, and how those other things express themselves in the world. Now we get to implementing this in your game world. We are going to talk about their interests and their purpose. This is the faction set in motion. This is everything we were talking about previously, but making its mark on the world. What they do with the tools that they have and the ideals they represent. Plots, actions, standing orders, and so on and so forth. Where is this faction focusing their attention? What is the goal of this faction in short term, mid-term, and long term? Going back to Game of Thrones again, we can talk about the Lannisters, or specifically Cersei Lannister, and her goal to blow up the Sept of the Seven. Baelor's Sept, I think it's called. I'm gonna be honest with you, I stopped watching the show after a certain point. In Game of Thrones, the goal is to become the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. That's the whole mission statement of that piece of media. You play the Game of Thrones, and you win or you die. Those are the outcomes. But if we kind of focus in a little closer on that particular situation, we see Cersei Lannister taking actions like blowing up the Sept of Baelor. In addition, we see actions like Marjorie Tyrell trying to build religious fervor, which puts them all in the Sept of Baelor to be blown up. So this example illustrates a couple of things that I want to talk about here with, what is your faction's goals in the long term, and what are they trying to do in the short term to reach those goals? And again, this is reliant on those two major things. The context of your world, just the material realities of your world, like dragons exist, or their relationship with other factions. Is your faction of spies trying to outwit the chief of police for the corrupt tyrant? The relationships between factions here provide midterm goals on the journey to your end goal. So how do you establish this for your faction? For my factions, I often ask myself, what are they doing right now? At this moment in the story, where the player characters are, what is this faction trying to accomplish? What steps are they taking to accomplish it? I have it phrased really well here. What are they trying to accomplish in the long run, and what is the mile marker they're trying to reach on that path at the present moment? So the example I have is they want to protect the king / they're trying to track down an assassin who escaped from prison. And again, many of these goals are in response to other factions. Maybe a faction tried to spring this assassin from its royal prison. Factions are often trying to maneuver for position or power or leverage. They're trying to get the upper hand over their enemies. Or they're just trying to build resources or build economic clout. Multiple factions could, and often do, have the same interests or purpose, just as some factions are formed specifically for their purpose. A great example of that is the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This is a faction whose sole purpose in life is to defend the Holy Grail. The Nazis want the Grail as well, which brings these two factions into direct conflict. As a result, this provides each faction with a set of goals, or things they want to try. The last stop on this journey into the world of factions is people. This is the micro of this micro to macro scale. Factions are people. People are the individual units of a faction, the things that, taken together, make up the faction's body. You can't make up a faction without coming up with the people that it is comprised of. When you're thinking about the people who make up a faction, there are two distinct directions you should be thinking in. One, you should be thinking about the hierarchy of the faction, like the central characters that make up the governing body of this faction and decide what direction this faction is going to travel in. For example, is it a council? Is it a pyramid scheme in which one person controls a couple of people who control a couple of people and so on? Who's in control? Who's calling the shots? Who are the main agents executing that person's vision? Who's important in the faction regardless of control? Like a child saint may not have much say over the decisions of his governing council, but this person is important nonetheless. And in the opposite direction of that, Who are the hoi polloi? Who are the boots on the ground of this faction? And what does any given person who is plucked at random from the roster look like? And we're talking about demographics. Who does this faction recruit? Are we talking about uneducated religious fanatics, or maybe highly educated religious fanatics? Are we talking about lower strata of society, or are we talking about higher rung? Who do they recruit? What type of person is a member? An important touchstone here is that everyone in the faction should agree on one level or another with the ideals of the faction. Or, they could be lying about the fact that they agree with the ideals and, are using it for their own nefarious ends. But the point remains that everyone in the faction should exist in relation with the ideals of the faction. So how do you come up with the demographics of your faction? This seems like a pretty big concept to tackle, but it's really not that hard. When I'm making a faction, I like to come up with a central cast and a cast of extras. So the central cast is the list of people who are important or central to the faction at large. If the player characters want to interact with the faction, these are the people that they'll be having the conversations with. And for each one of them, all you really have to do is come up with a name, maybe a brief description, and why they're in the faction. The other side of that coin is the bit players, the extras, or the cast of thousands. When I'm coming up with the extras for a faction, I like to think about maybe a general profile of who is hired for this faction. Who signs up and what do they do? What one person, or two or three, plucked at random from the roster of this faction might look like. So if your players weren't a part of this faction, or weren't engaged with this faction's plot, then these are the people that they might come across on the street. Or, they might interrupt them carrying captives to a sacrifice, or something like that. So we're nearing the end of the video. We've come up with the ideals of the faction, who this faction is and what they represent in the world, whether they're a force for good or evil, or a force for knowledge or chaos, that sort of thing. We've also come up with the facts of this faction, what this faction is in the context of your world. Next up, of course, we have the flavor, or the theme of your faction. This is an important step because it gives your faction a symbol or a shorthand that players will know them by. The more things you can come up in that category of theme or flavor, the more powerful the image of this faction is going to be to your audience. After that, we have the interests, or the purpose of this faction. This is, to say what they're doing, what this faction is trying to accomplish in the world. And maybe building out a couple of steps from here to there that they're going to try to accomplish along the way. And of course, last but not least, we have the people of the faction, the individual units of this faction that, pushed together, all make up the faction. Without these people, the faction doesn't exist. So, how do you use factions? What will manifest in your game after you've come up with all of this stuff? From the ground up, you've got the people. Who do your players encounter? What do they look like? What do they sound like? And what do they do? By coming up with a list of these people, or a general profile, you have something that your players can bump into in the world, even if they're not related to this faction. And if the faction members keep showing up in suspicious circumstances, like maybe you come across them again and again when there are murders, then a player knows that something's afoot with this particular group. Likewise, once your players become more acquainted with a faction, they have someone to come to talk over the faction's interests, and how the players exist in relation to these interests. And there you have interests and purpose. This is what your players encounter when they encounter the faction. Or rather, this is what they encounter the faction doing. So say your players just go to shop, and there's a person wearing a mask holding up the shopkeeper for protection money. That is probably a member of a faction. This is also when your players will encounter this faction. If you've done the work of what their goals are, or what their tactics are, or what their standing orders are, then you already have this built out. Anytime your players happen to engage with that particular area, then they'll encounter the members of this faction. We come then to the flavor, or the theme. This is the sign by which your players will know this faction. If they keep coming across ritualistic murders with the same eyeball drawn in blood, then they know that there is a faction responsible for these actions. And so if they're given a job to investigate like disappearances in a village and keep coming across the eyeball, then they're like, it's the Crimson Eye. Theme and flavor helps establish your faction as a character in and of itself. The facts of your faction are the board, the pieces, the arguments, and the techniques used to debate them. The facts of the factions that you use are going to establish the context in which the players are going to engage with the world. And finally, we come to the ideals, which decides which team your players are going to side with. None of these pieces alone makes a faction, and any of them can provide a good starting place through which you can come up with a faction in its entirety. The important thing to remember is that there is no such thing as a faction alone. Factions exist in relationship with and in response to other organizations of people, or in response to conditions of the world that you've established. At its heart, a faction is a group of people who have an opinion about something in your world. Conflict, and therefore story, comes from groups of people who have different opinions on the same topic. It's up to you to decide which opinions exist, but it's up to your players to decide which opinions win out. On the one hand, they could side with the faction that has a lot of resources, that's fierce and warlike, with really cool uniforms. On the other hand, they could side with a faction that favors teamwork and cooperation, that favors individual virtue and collective might. Because have you ever seen a duck flying in formation? It's beautiful. Pretty awesome how they all stick together. Ducks never say die. Ever seen a duck in a fight? No way. Why? Because the other animals are afraid of them. They know that if they mess with one duck, they gotta mess with the whole flock. I'm proud to be a duck. Quack. Quack, 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 quack. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I had a blast making it. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. If you have any questions or comments or something you'd like me to go over in more detail, please feel free to send me a message on Twitter at the username below that I can never remember, or just leave me a comment here. My name is Dungeon Master Lee, and I am here to guide you through a whole new world. Have a good day, bye!